definitions, provide you a policy, and then followed by 2 arguments. So quickly, definitions. What are hate crimes? We tell you that hate crimes are oftentimes crimes against humanity. For example, beating black people up, shooting black people, police brutality, defaming black monuments, and like things like verbal abuse, right? And all these things are based on hate for African Americans. What does this mean? This means the only reason for me to commit a crime is because of my prejudices and biasness on hating African Americans, like police brutality and like hate for African Americans. These are things that oftentimes go unchecked. So in places like South Carolina, one of the most conservative states in the United States, and these are things that happens a lot, and like things that oftentimes people get away with. So we think that these are also places where African Americans feel unsafe. What is our policy? Number one, we make it. So what does this mean? This means that we'll give it legitimacy, right? There will be rules and regulations towards it. So we cannot do anything that are unrelated to hate crimes, right? Cool. So number one, historic significance. We have to this state is because of the system, is because of what happened in the past. So when we look at American history, right, African Americans were taken in from all these African states and made slaves in Confederate states like South Carolina, right, and like they were forced to work in places like cotton fields and whatnot. We believe that after the Civil War, a lot of sentiments still remain, and a lot of people. And these sentiments push black people into poor areas and also made things like legislation harder to be passed that gives AA to African Americans, for example. This also so when we're talking about things like this, right, this means that the only reason like African Americans are 50% consist of the prison system, right? Like 50% of them are in prisons, despite them consisting less than 25% of America is worried. And the only reason they have to do this, they have to behave this way in society is because of the systemic oppression that happened to them in the past. We think that black people are underprivileged because the state simply does not care about them. This means that why do this biasness exist, right? We think that oftentimes these are unfounded religious biasness, oftentimes by indoctrination, and a lot of these biases are baseless. For in places like churches or like in white households where they go ahead and hate black people and say racist things on a regular basis, and all of these are baseless and unjust reasons. So these are preconceived biases. So we think at the plight, and we don't think the state cares about
narratives or preconceived notions that individuals have towards African Americans.
We think at the point at which you can see African Americans fighting back for their rights is when you see that, look, African Americans are not strong, and we think it keeps them in check. Like, more about this in the next phase. But even if we don't get this, we think it's extremely important for them to feel safe, and this will translate into my next argument, the safe place argument. So we think that the state always has to have the best interest of their people at mind, because we think that the state is the only party that can do this. We think the state is the only one that can provide after these years of oppression. We at the fastest rate and ensure safe. So number two, this whole idea of this safe place argument, right? We think at the point at which oppression has translated into black people only living in poor communities, has translated into them not getting good education, them not having the same accessibility as a white person to do certain things. Now, at the point at which groups like this exist, I as a black person can go out and actually feel safe. What does this mean? This means that I'm more likely to do things and feel safer, right? And I think it's extremely important because we think in states like this, the environment in which you live in is extremely hostile, right? Like whether I go out, I don't know, like anything I do can be interpreted as an act of violence. Like anything I do, because the community is extremely racist, right? We think that you deserve a safe place that, in this circumstance. Like, I think black people deserve the right to feel that I don't need to worry about this because now it'll keep them in check. Because at the point of which the state actually legislates this and allows people to act like this, we think that you're less likely to go ahead and commit hate crimes to begin with. But even if they do, they occur less. And even if they do, like black people can get reparations when this happens, and they deserve the sense of security. Either one of you.
Yeah, so will these all African American organizations have full autonomy on their actions with their weapons?
Here's the thing, right? When we're talking about the United States, weapons already exist, so you can't really talk about that. But the thing is, we think that, in my policy we already stated that you can only act when there's a crime of aggression. At the point at which you act when there isn't a hate crime, then we will prosecute you in court. So we also have to understand that status quo isn't getting better. These preconceived biases are continuing continuously being indoctrinated. So there's no incentive for them to change. And later on in the speech, we'll show you why there's more incentive to change on our side. So we have to understand. So what have I told you? I told you because of this historic significance, black people deserve a chance to fight, and we think we give them that chance to fight. We think they get happy at the point they can fight. We think that's not something you can give them. Number two, we think black people deserve a safe place, a place where they can actually feel happy. And we think since America is the state that says, when you come here, we will make you happy, since they should be given this promise. With that, give me a scholarship or something.
Lifetime Prime Minister. Lifetime Prime Minister, let's start the case for opposition. Let's have lead off op. Here.
Test. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay. If side of government wants to solve a certain issue in these areas, I think it's important to understand what the root of that issue is. Just because African Americans are being attacked and these are people who don't feel safe, it does not mean attacking back is the best solution. If side of government thinks that this is the best way in solving the issue, I think it's important for them to compare it with other alternatives that exist in trying to combat these very issues. We didn't get that explanation from them. What's the stance that opposition will take? It is simple. We do not want to increase tensions within these areas and harm African Americans even more. The point in which you aggravate that war and you create even more reason for these individuals to induce hate crimes onto African Americans, I think that's when you make the problem much bigger, and then we'll see how you solve it. So what does the world of opposition look like? We would support and stick to things like peaceful protest, talking, and having discussions. This means African Americans in positions of power trying to advocate for change and talking about the grassroots issues that African Americans face. I think these are better alternatives. Even if we will take longer, we would rather fight the good fight rather than do what is simple and just shoot our attackers. Because this can never happen in the world of government, when you have a radical group which conflicts the very perception as to what the African Americans truly want. The point in which you have a huge group fighting against these individuals, holding guns and bearing arms, I think that is the point in which it's more difficult for you to have any sort of peaceful protest, because your movement is one that is split altogether. So I have two arguments in my speech. Number one, how this policy doesn't solve the root of the problem, instead makes it worse. And secondly, how you destroy the existing support structures for African Americans. Have a seat. But before that, let's just take a look at their very policy, right? If you're attacked, only then can you actually attack back. This means that your African Americans don't even have full autonomy over the weapons that you are giving them. This means they still need to depend on the white individuals inducing hate crimes onto these people. So what kind of control are you actually giving these individuals? Sure, they may feel a bit safer, but the point in which the white people in your community have more of a reason to attack you, they hate you more, I don't think I would feel a whole lot safer if I'm in that situation, if I'm in that situation. But before I move on to my first argument, yeah, sure.
Things like Black Lives Matter already exist, but we can see that these things do not work within society. Why is then an act of aggression not justified?
because your act of aggression cancels out whatever progress these movements have already made. I think sure, it may be slow, it's not what everyone wants, but to begin with, right, I think these are all huge monuments in the fight for the African Americans, and this side of the house would fully reject and push away all that progress you have already made simply because it is too slow or just not what they want. I think fighting the good fight is better rather than doing what you think is simple. So let's explain the first argument, how this policy doesn't solve the root of the problem. Recognizing, and we agree with the Prime Minister when he says there's a lot of hate crime and racism in these areas, but I think they fail to understand that the reason as to why all these things happen and the lack of acceptance is a result of the lack of understanding towards African Americans within these communities. When people in those areas don't understand your struggles, they don't understand the history of oppression that's happened, that is why it's difficult for them to accept you, because they don't even know who you actually are. Why can't people understand this even more in the world of government? Because you change the focus of the fight to become about attacking your oppressors. When you make it an us versus them mentality, it's very difficult for you to obtain that unity within these areas. You can never achieve it if you're telling them to attack people, because that is not the way in which you actually cooperate with one another. When you have more discussions in their world about violence, about how you win your war, that is when you lose time that could have been used to discuss about the true struggles that these people have faced and trying to communicate with your oppressors and getting them to understand. Have you seen? And I think the role of media will further aggravate these very issues. The fact that media sensationalizes certain issues and just to get more views and clicks on social media, for example. So this means when they talk about racism, they won't be talking about the African American victim who got shot. They will rather highlight the actions of this movement in retaliating and attacking those individuals who hurt the African American even more. If in status quo there's already a bias against African Americans in the media, where for example they phrase you as a dangerous individual, as an evil person already exists in status quo, I think it will be a whole lot worse in the world of government. The point in which these individuals have no opportunity to understand and the media isn't going to help it in any way, I think it's very difficult to have any form of constructive discussions in the world of government. What is the comparative on our world? We don't give them the opportunity to take the focus away from the true issues. So I think on a scale, the side of opposition has less of a chance of swaying the discussion away from the grassroots problems and the historical oppression, and it's less likely for us to talk about all this violence. I think if the side of government agrees that the problem is a structural issue and the state has to do something about it, that is something we have to talk about. We shouldn't be talking about whether this guy should have shot the white man back, but I think we should talk about the things which the state is lacking in. But in the world of government, they'll never be able to have those discussions because the media will always make it about these violent.
On that point,
Secondly, sure.
we are like normalized with Black Lives Matter protests and whatnot, right? How are conversations then more valuable on your side? I think when at the point of which you have aggressive behavior, it sparks better conversations.
Okay, if you claim that it's normalized, then you're saying there's no problem. But obviously hate crimes are still happening, so people in these areas are normalized and they don't already understand this issue. I think that's why we should push on rather than change the fight altogether. But how do you destroy existing support structures for African Americans? These supporting structures fund your very movements. They increase your numbers for your cause. And this includes people from the majority, so white individuals. And now it's more difficult for these people to support your very movement. A movement that is literally against white people means it's more difficult for people of the majority to want to support your movement. So even if they want to support, people put them in difficult positions, and I think it's difficult for you to get the benefit of your movement at the end of the day. But African Americans, some is the movement, and that's bad, because you lose the number game, you are less credible altogether. I think a split movement that exists in the world of government is one which is a lot less effective. You lose the movement as a support structure, and that is why your people can never be safe. The point in which you have nobody to fall back upon.
Right hand leader of Op, let's have Deputy Prime Minister here.
Change better happens when the oppressed community actively involves themselves to go against that form of oppression. The world of opposition is a world where the oppressed community lives in constant fear and is unlikely to even go against the oppression they face. There's a reason why the hate crimes continue and continue to be rampant. There's a reason why it has never changed, even though the courts are there, even though there are police there as well. I think it was very convenient for side opposition to deny the context set forth by my first speaker on what these communities are, so we enforce that as well. We say these safe places are extremely important because they are not existent in these communities. In a world where there's a high rate, is based upon them living in an echo chamber, where there's a strong amount of individuals in those societies that believe in the very same narrative, and it simply bounces back, and is oftentimes indoctrinated again to the children and whatnot. We think in those particular communities, very likely for your white Americans to stand a very heavy portion in comparison to a small community of African Americans. That's why African Americans feel actively oppressed in comparison to states where there's a strong amount of liberal presence. I'm going to tell you why there's not a strong amount of liberal presence in the world of government. In the world that is in status quo as well. But Aiman's case, right? They said how we're going to make things worse. I think they talk about a few things. They talk about how the peaceful protests and whatever will work. I'll prove to you why this alternative, first of all, don't exist at all in status quo because they mischaracterize the context in this debate. Second, we see you're unlikely to change anything at all. The point is, I'll crash into my argumentation on how the mentality of African Americans are extremely important to fight this, and how the element of fear is existing in the world of opposition, and how we say we degrade the element of fear and make sure it's non-existent on the world of government. So let's start, right? First of all, this is about how attacking back isn't the best solution. I'm telling you this exclusive mechanism. Understanding that in that particular community, the white Americans are oftentimes very powerful and stronger than the African Americans. The fact that they're able to actively commit hate crimes and still continue on means very likely that courts in those particular communities are extremely biased, and oftentimes people they have also been indoctrinated with the exact same narratives that oppress African American communities as well. The point is that communities are unable to change, and why is that so? Because there are no active liberal people that want to fight for those communities as well. I think as an African American protester and as a person that fights for those rights, you're likely to fight the easier fight first. You fight those liberal communities first. You fight situations where you know you have a likely chance of winning in the first place. We think these individuals who try to fight for the rights of African American minorities are unlikely to go to the hate communities where hate crimes are rampant. First of all, we told you there's a large portion of white Americans in comparison to African Americans, which means that if they try to fight those fights, it's going to be the effects are going to vary, then aren't going to be as strong in comparison. Because they say they're trying, because in their own perspective, they need to fight the bigger fight first. The point is they managed to fight for more African Americans in the fray in these communities. We say it's important for these communities to also be helped, and they are only helped in our world. So, I'm talking about mentality of individuals, right? Good confidence in the world of government in change through peaceful protest, because there's no backing, there's no foundation. Foundation only exists in the world of government where we form our group. I think the concept of having something to fall back on, a fund that's exclusive, actually target and back them up. I think the push they know there's a foundation, that oftentimes means they are more likely to know that the importance of the rights are being valued in society. Understand that they might not be individuals that actively know the value of their rights in status quo due to systematic oppression that's oppressed them from the very beginning of the day. The point in which they actively allow hate crimes to continue and the courts never actively fight for their rights and whatnot. But before I continue on how that actually affects change, sure.
So African Americans on your side cannot shoot people who they think is suspicious, but they can only shoot someone the point in which their friend has already been.
The point in which they know that somebody there is being valued and achieved. The one in status quo which I prove is that those particular rights are only exclusive to the world of liberal communities where there are actively people trying to fight for their rights. In the areas where rampant hate crimes, that's not likely to happen because there aren't any focus on individuals trying to change those communities to begin with. That's why hate crimes continue to be rampant in your world. Now, that's about the mentality of individuals, right? I think for African American individuals, you actively need to be involved in the process of creating change. That means you actively need to be in part of the rallies, be in part of fighting the oppression that exists to go against any white perpetrators at all. That's not likely to happen in the world of status quo because you don't have any backing or any foundation. Even if there's a person like Obama, the focus of those communities only exists in the world where the group on the side of government. That means they actively know there's a group that actively helps them, there's a group that shows them that their rights is justified. So in the worst case scenario, right, let's say they actively go into conflict, they protest and they are shamed and they are shunned and they are shot by the white American communities. We think that's also a benefit on our side. Sure, it's a very sad fact that some amount of African Americans are sacrificed in this process. But I think this is a world where you achieve a lot of greater change. So let's talk about how we actually change the white narratives, right? I think the white narratives are changed when they realize that their narratives are wrong. The point in the status quo is a world where white Americans are oppressed for no reason because they were indoctrinated in the same system of hate. I think it's important for that sort of awareness to come in. The impact that you create when African Americans go some impact that actually makes them think, what did I do wrong? Is this justified or not? That one is only exclusive when African American individuals can actively go to the government and the country has failed them and they have failed to give them the right.
Let's have Deputy Leader of Opposition. Go ahead.
I'm still unsure as to what they are taking up arms and shooting your will be laws, where these people should be punished. The individuals that get their support at the end of the day. Because realize this, after the two substantive speeches that we heard from the government side, none of them proved to us how the long-term effect will be for these African American individuals. How will they integrate back to society? How will they actually fit in with the rest of the American community when they are painted as dangerous individuals that will attack you back? They are sensitive, they will shoot you if you said something wrong. I don't know why you will get acceptance in the world of government. I don't know why you will feel safer, because the same mentality could be used by the white Americans that you solely wanted to protect yourself from. The point in which you shoot the white American is the point in which the white American will shoot you. And then everyone just dies. Like, it's so stupid that you say you can give protection when people are literally going to be dying in the world of government. Two arguments I'll bring to you. Number one, why the idea of fear is one that will be perpetrated even more in the world of government. And number two, why the fight in a long-term and short-term effect is one that will be far worse for the most marginalized individuals in society. So the idea of fear, rebuttals are integrated into this. The first thing is that the idea of shooting a perpetrator is one that's not preemptive but is proactive. So the harm has already been done. You're not going to deter more individuals from doing it because your white Americans are also very powerful and you also have a lot of guns. So the point in which your black Americans start shooting is also when your white Americans are going to shoot as well. And considering how they have more money, considering how they can be able to access more guns and have all your AR weapons and all, like the mental patient who shot in the parking shooting, whatever, like those are kinds of circumstances you put these African Americans into, and they're unable to protect themselves as well because they started the fight and they're not being able to win that fight as well. I think it's unnecessary for them to do so, especially when that harm is already being done upon these individuals. The second thing is that we tell you things will get far worse because of the notion that African Americans are already dangerous and already violent. Now when media companies have actual footage of you shooting or actual footage of African Americans shooting a white American, they will circulate that non-stop. That's all you ever see in your Facebook and Instagram. That's all you ever think about African Americans when you see them on the streets. If you wanted to say that African Americans don't feel safe on the streets, now they're even less safer because the point in which the white American sees African Americans, he'll start taking out the gun and aiming it at your head. So I don't know why individuals be safer or why fear be far lesser when actually you're increasing the amount of fear that exists in society by literally fear-mongering these individuals with pictures and videos of African Americans fighting back. I think it's abhorrent for them to say your fear is lesser when it's far worse. The second thing is, we'll say it validates the narrative that white people are correct. That white people always say, you should not trust an African American, he will shoot you, you should not trust an African American, he will rob you, he'll break the law, you should, like, he's not the same as you. You're literally validating that. White Americans don't do this. If they do, good for them, good for the African Americans. They can say, look at them, they are doing this, I'm not, I think I'm the bigger person here. You will lose that power, you will lose that ability to fight for change. I think fear is one that goes to white Americans, and that's how you lose the fight for African Americans in this circumstance. Before I move on, are there any POIs? No, alright. So let's talk about how the fight will look like in the world of government. Number one, African Americans lose the ability to use the victim card. I think this is really important. African Americans have been suffering for a really long time. The only way for you to garner sympathy, the only way for you to garner acceptance is for you to garner sympathy from the majority of individuals in the world or in America. How do you do this best? I think there are multiple ways to do it, but I think the most impactful one is playing the sympathy card by saying that I'm in this circumstance because of what happened to me in the past. The point in which you attack back is also the point in which you will lose the time and effort to actually play the sympathy card anymore because your media attention is not directed towards your wars. But secondly, is that people won't believe your victim card anymore because you are not the victim. You are the perpetrator that have killed other white Americans. You are the perpetrator that is shooting individuals when it's clearly against the law. So really, you lose the avenue for you to fight for change and to fight for acceptance. The second thing we'll say is that there's more ammunition for bigoted individuals or individuals on the ground who don't support your movement yet. The point in which all this validation exists is the point in which your stereotypes are propagated even more. The moment the stereotypes are propagated is the moment you lose support. Why is this support really important? Aiman's analysis from the past 7 minutes, no responses whatsoever. Because we told you, you need to play the number games. You need to suck up to the majority of individuals because you need their participation. You need their help. You need their support because that's the only way you're going to garner critical mass and get policy changes from the government. That's the only way for you to feel safer. Realizing that maybe it's not principally fair that some individuals were harmed in the process, but at least in the long term, we can at least guarantee some change for these individuals. Maybe not totally, but we can already see status quo on trend analysis that lives of African Americans are getting better. There were slaves before, they're not now. I think there's already enough of evidence for you to suggest that it's clearly working, at least in a slow process, but it's working. That side of the house makes it worse. Yeah.
How does this work at the point of which they can only react with aggression at the point of which there are hate crimes committed to them first?
Okay, yeah, exactly. This is a victim card thing. If I was hated upon and someone murdered my friend, that's when I can go, guys, look at this fella, he murdered my friend. But I can't do that if I shoot the fella who murdered my friend, right? Then you don't have that form of sympathy garnering. You don't have the ability to communicate or interact with the majority anymore. So you lose the support and lose the sympathy. Very simple to understand. I'm not sure what's the problem with them. The fourth thing we'll tell you is that this fight is unsustainable. So in the short term, you're just going to have a lot of guns and a lot of shooting, a lot of bullets being wasted, a lot of money gone. But in the long term, is that they fail to really analyze how these African Americans will be able to integrate back to society, because that's the main purpose of the whole movement essentially. Because if you're going to be a movement that's mean and going to kill individuals, I don't know how individuals from the movement will be able to live a normal life after the whole process is done. Because you will still live in the scenario where you're mean, you'll still live in a scenario where you're violent, who will shoot you back. So you're not going to get the integration that you so want for these African American individuals. It's one that's unsustainable. Also realizing that white people are probably more richer since they already have higher positions of power, they probably have more guns to shoot you as well. So what's the comparative? That side of the house wanted to give you the principle that African Americans need to fight back. We do not say that's false. We do have avenues for African Americans to fight back. You can have peaceful protests, you can have people in power who are politicians like Barack Obama and yada yada yada. I think it's unfair for them to say that there's no other avenue for African Americans to do so, especially when Aiman told you how the other avenues are better and it doesn't harm the movement far more. We beg to oppose.
I'd like to thank Deputy Leader of Opposition. Let's have government with here.
Side opposition is the side which tells us, pull ourselves up by the bootstraps, but do not provide us the boots to do so. I think it's important to recognize that on our side of the house, we achieve something that they cannot achieve given context of these communities. So I'm going to be dealing with four main issues. The first of which, peaceful protesting. They say, oh, African Americans can use other avenues to protect themselves in these communities. Things like peaceful protest, things like lobbying for change. And then when you act with this form of military action, you reverse all of those processes that happen. I do not think this is the case, simply because in many of these communities, the idea of peaceful protesting to further your ideas more often not doesn't achieve the kind of change you want. In these kinds of communities where hate crimes are rampant, so perhaps in maybe like liberal or semi-moderate communities, peaceful protesting can allow you to achieve some sort of marginal success. But in these kinds of communities where hate crimes are rampant and where the system in itself is against you, it becomes very difficult for even peaceful protests to garner any sort of localized support. Because the reality is, the local establishment is still going to be against you. They can still have the capacity to ignore much of your protesting because it doesn't impact them in a way in which they need to retaliate. They need to retaliate actively. So a peaceful protest doesn't mean that, oh, I'm going to fight back now. Like, there is no incentive for these people in these regions who are already biased to actually need to consider the needs of African Americans, considering these peaceful protests don't impact them in a way which is visceral. So now split movement. You're going to split African Americans. This is something they mentioned. Because some people are going to support the movement, some people are going to decline the movement. I think in a large set of circumstances, we already said in our initial policy that this movement is, number one, organized by the state. Number two, this movement still is confined within, the movement is not above the law in the sense that it's not vigilantism, it's a program subjected by the state which is sent into these areas to conduct these operations. So it's not actually vigilantism in a sense, but it's rather programs that it's rather a group of individuals that is sent in to conduct these actions. So I think that all the arguments, that white people are not going to support you in your other communities, I think this is false. And I think even in the situation where white people don't support you, in many of the communities they wouldn't support you anyways, because they're already entrenched in their biases. So they're less likely to actually help you fight the fight that you want to fight. So amongst the African Americans who choose not to join this movement, I don't think that African Americans who choose not to join this movement are going to be shamed. But even if African Americans who don't join this movement are likely to feel that they should join the movement or they feel that they should move into this movement, considering the communities in which they live in, they're probably better off arming themselves so they are just living their lives the way they are. Considering the kinds of barriers that actually exist, and considering the nature of the threats which face them, they're probably better off arming themselves than not. So now the idea that, since you can't shoot suspicious people, only people who have actually acted, now white people wouldn't care, they just fire you back, they have more guns. Now, I think this is a flawed pretext. I think it's wrong to say that any form of deterrence doesn't work because you only do it when someone. I think deterrence is still a way in which you can ensure that people won't do stuff. So white Americans will still have a degree of fear in these areas to not act because they know that they will be retaliated on by this movement. I think that's a given. I think that they can't say that white Americans will still fight back when there will be a war. I don't think it will escalate to that kind of war, but even if it does escalate to to localized conflict zones, I think it's better that black people actually fight that battle rather than live lives where they're continuously oppressed in an asymmetrical war where they are continuously supplanted by these individuals. Because the reality is, these white people are more likely they're not going to shoot them anyway. These white people are going to use things like lynching, the mobs, the KKK, to target these individuals anyway. So the point at which they fight back, at least they die fighting rather than die victims. And I think that's a principle which is strongly supported on our side of the house and that they can't claim on their side of the house. They say, we cannot use the victim card, the fourth contention. The victim card isn't available in this scenario. I think that black people are posing that the victim card is the best way to achieve success in these communities. I think the victim card, more often than not, in these communities in particular, isn't the best way in which you achieve success. Because the white Americans in these communities where hate crimes are rampant don't actually buy the victim card. More often than not, they feel the victim card is a false achievement. They believe the victim card is a lie. They believe that the victim card is just something that they call out and they don't actually able to. That doesn't actually make sense. They don't have the means, they don't actually act on the victim card. So the victim card becomes useless in the point at which these communities aren't able to register the victim card. And I think communities outside these areas are still going to accept black people as victims of circumstance, considering they only fight back once these actions happen, and considering that they are still supplanted structurally and still supplanted economically by white Americans. So if white Americans retaliate with better weapons, then black people still get the victim card. And if white people don't retaliate with better weapons, then black people still protect themselves. So either way, we still win the fight on our side of the house. So, lastly, I think a lot of what's coming out on side opposition is the fact that this organic change is going to be beneficial. And let's say this organic change is beneficial. Let's say that, 100 or so years from now, organic change does work. It's important to realize that a lot of the black people who have suffered in the process cannot be discredited. We need to ensure that the change that we enact is something that can happen quickly and something that will actually promote some sort of retaliation. If you don't have a reason for white people to care about your rights and for white people to actually have their own personal incentives to fight back against you, or for personal incentives to come to the table, they will never come to the table. Because the reality is, unless black people are shooting back, they're just likely to continue shooting at them. I think it's only the point at which black people shoot back that white people have an actual reason to say stop. Okay, now we need to reconsider what we're doing. We need to understand that something is wrong and we need to put ourselves to the table. And even if white people don't do that, I think it's still better on our side where black people actually get to shoot back rather than a society where black people don't get to shoot back and they just get trampled on by the society which they live in. I think it's a long shot on side opposition. They want to achieve this long gradual change. They say, oh, Americans were slaves then, they're not now, therefore things are better. It's important to actually realize that slavery was achieved through a war in the first place. I mean, like, the emancipation was achieved through a war in the first place. And all of those small structural changes, like the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, those were all things that were achieved mainly in the northern states. These were achieved in areas where civil rights were already established by the community. But in these areas where hate crimes are happening, these are areas where these black Americans still suffer from these same structural barriers which they did much throughout the earlier years. And in these places, they need to fight back or else they may never fight again. Thank you.
Then the substantive speakers, let's have opposition whip. Here.
Hello. Side opposition thinks that what the government whip said about peaceful protesters not being effective in these areas of rampant hate crimes, we think that this is not true. Because just because these protests in hate crimes don't work doesn't mean that protests in other areas have failed. Because the fight for African Americans movement is much more than in these areas. So peaceful protests outside are also important because it leads to like African Americans being accepted more outside these areas, right? And why is this important? Because that means this African American community is stronger in these areas of rampant hate crimes. Because people now, when crimes are being done towards them, now they have someone to fall back on outside these areas. Now they have like peaceful protests that they can rely on that aren't failing in these areas because they are working outside them where and then we can see that black people outside these areas are being accepted. So in Gulf's world, they harm the perception towards all African Americans because even outside these areas and African Americans even outside these areas when they are armed, because once you do a crime against these white people, they are all going to crack down on you, and all the peaceful protests outside are going to be overshadowed by the media attention towards all this violence. They're going to be talking about all the violence instead of these peaceful protests. That's why this motion is unjustified on your side. I have one issue for this debate, which is which side better helps the African American movement more and does not that worsen this current situation. So the way to increase support, and this has been said by my previous two speakers, is through gaining sympathy, not increasing tension, not increasing hate towards African Americans, and not putting the violent mentality into African Americans and the majority alike. So let's compare these two sides. So in government, in the long term, when we're talking about African Americans, it won't be about their suffering, it won't be about the challenges they face. It will be about how they retaliate against the majority and how they use guns to shoot them. It will be focused upon how they are evil, how they use guns, and how they are like standing up to their to the dominant people. And this adds to the bias of how African Americans are destructive and dangerous. And this doesn't increase the understanding towards the African Americans, and instead the perception towards them are strengthened when other people see that they are even worse than they thought. So secondly, the movement can't use victim cards now because now they are also doing violence. They are also like committing crimes against other people. They are not the people who are suffering on the ground, not the person being beat up. Now they are the people who are shooting others. Now they are the people who everyone thinks is savage and violent to white people. So now these media attacks will increase on all these black people, and then they will, and everyone who supported, like even white people who supported this, the white people who supported the African American movement will have, will like be less likely to support them now because they see like their friends and family getting shot by the people they support. Yeah, but before that, yeah.
African Americans are people who have been disenfranchised for decades. Why is it more important that we do not harm the perception than keeping these people safe and finally giving them a voice to express themselves and like to actually feel safe within a community?
First of all, they're not going to feel safe when they start shooting at white people because now these people are going to use the mentality that if they harm us, then we should harm them back against them. That means they're going to, white people are going to like bring guns everywhere, and once they see a black person, they're going to shoot that person because that's what they did to me. And now these black people are going to live in more fear than in status quo. So even if people like want to support this African American movement, they will find it like much more difficult because no one wants to be seen supporting a movement that's killing like all your friends, killing all your family, because it's different from the movement that you once knew that wasn't taking up arms against everyone. So on opposition, these black people are seen as victims. They are seen as survivors of violent discrimination against them, and it's better. We think that it's better to support and give media attention to black people in power instead of using weapons. So on our side, there are white people that also support African Americans because they don't see that African Americans are violent and that their idea of a peaceful movement is not damaged. So government also said that blacks, African Americans will feel safe if they retaliate. But like I said, whites will use this as a weapon against them. Now they have a reason to shoot at them. Now they have a reason to like attack them more. Besides just the fact that they are a racial minority, and this cycle will continue because blacks, African Americans will also continue shooting people. And in government's world, the African American movement is divided, as mentioned in my Prime Minister's speech, because now there will be people who support peaceful talks, and there will be people who think that violence is the only way to resolve this problem. So the efforts to fight for rights will be divided into two, thus diluting the effectiveness, because it's not one goal anymore, which is for peaceful protests. And Gulf benefits to strengthen the movement no longer exist. And the movement also suffers because they lose the moral high ground in discussions because they are killing people too. They are not the ones getting bullied. They're bullying other people. So why does opposition win? We prove why violence worsens the stigma towards African Americans and why peaceful protest is the right way to achieve their rights. Never prouder to host.
I thank Opway. Start off with reply speeches. Let's have Op reply. Get here.
That's all good. Yeah, okay. When the problem that exists is a problem of segregation and misunderstanding, I think the solution in solving that issue, I think the solution in solving that problem is to tackle the root of the issue and try to get these people to understand. Try to have discussions with these people and try to have as constructive as possible of a discussion. Compared to the world of government, where they do what they think is easier. Because you do not want to wait any longer and it's much easier to just shoot these people, I think that is a solution that doesn't solve the problem. Because just because you reduce the number of people that are going to commit this hate crime because you just shoot them down, it doesn't mean you reduce any form of incentive for them to want to hurt you to begin with. I think when you aggravate the war and you give them more ammunition, more reason to hurt you, and now African Americans have less of an ability to gain sympathy within these issues, they are forced into a war which they cannot escape, a war which is unsustainable in protecting African Americans. Two issues in today's debate. Firstly, in which world are African Americans safer? And secondly, when is the fight for African Americans much better? So let's take a look at the first one. In which world are African Americans safer? I think what side government does is induce a mentality which tells people that if you are attacked, you can always attack back. And that is the response that they're going to do. What does this mean? This means they are less likely to ask why these people are doing so. This means these people are less likely to try and talk with the perpetrator, or at least these two communities are less likely to come together and try to get an agreement. Rather, the immediate response is going to be one which is more violent, which is more aggressive, and you immediately shoot back. And I think this is horrible because it also means white people, or the majority in these circumstances, can also use this mentality to your advantage. And this is something that came out in Sanjiivan's speech, which wasn't responded to whatsoever, right? I think the point in which white people can also use this very mentality to hurt African Americans by saying, I was also shot, I'm going to shoot him back. It's more difficult because now you cannot tell that person to not use that mentality, because the African Americans you're trying to protect are using the very same ideology to begin with. So I think that's why you aggravate the war even more. When you tell people the immediate solution is violence and to fight back against your oppressors, I do not understand how that is more safe. I think a world where people are more likely to target me, where I'm more likely to be shot by other people because I can also shoot them back. I think these are situations where it's a whole lot more dangerous. Because in the long term, African Americans will never be safe in the world of government. Because to solve the long-term issue, you need to make sure people understand and people want to communicate. If you never tackle these issues and you try to do what's quick and easy, it will never be a sustainable fight, and you can never fight till the end. Especially when with the media that exists, you will always have unproductive discussions as to how these people attack, or these people are just going to shoot more and more people, and when they focus on the number of people who are killed in that war, they are less likely to focus on why the tension exists in the first place. In the long run, you'll never solve racism. But secondly, when is the fight much better? So I think side of government cannot just say that because peaceful protests didn't work in these areas, therefore they should just take up guns and do whatever they want. We also need to take into account the consequences of the actions of these individuals. If you take up guns, it may seem easy for you, but it also cancels out whatever progress, whatever great peaceful protests that have already happened outside of these areas. And this leads to your movement being more split. So this means you lose the number game. Why would people join a movement which doesn't even know or can't even unify on a particular topic or direction? I think it's less likely for you to get funding from individuals, to get people to lobby for African Americans. That will never exist in the world of government. You also make the perception towards African Americans a whole lot worse when you validate the very narrative that these people are violent, these people will hurt you, and you cannot come into contact with them. I think when these individuals lose the victim card, they cannot gain sympathy, it's very difficult for you to fight for whatever acceptance that you truly want to do so. Just because it's easy doesn't mean it's right.
Like, thank all reply. To end today's debate, let's have Gov reply. Here.
Discourse outside. We say the first thing we'll do on reply speech is to point out all the things we cannot let side opposition get away with. They've literally mischaracterized and miscontexted what we brought to you in our case. All their harms on media and sensationalization is contingent upon the news being said African Americans shooting white Americans. We told you from the very start of our policy that it's a group that's official, one that's recognized by the government, and one that's standards or procedures that will punish white Americans accordingly if they commit hate crimes to begin with. I think it's very convenient for the side of opposition to mischaracterize the entire case. But second, they fail to debate on the right premise which they're engaged on, right? They think that the premise that we debate on, the community that exists, is one that's based off misunderstanding. No, we told you that this community is one that's active, pure, and blind hatred. Hatred that's been indoctrinated from the very beginning, hatred that's very hard to change, and a narrative that's very hard to break through. We told you that these communities live in an echo chamber. The conversations that affect change in their world don't exist. You need something impactful. You need something strong enough to impact the change, and especially considering our characterization, which told you that oftentimes, there are hardly anybody that tries to help the communities in that particular area because there's no legitimate incentive to do so because the fight is so hard. And we also explicitly told you the importance of the oppressed communities' involvement in fighting the true case and in fighting for their rights. That doesn't happen in the world of opposition. In a world they're constantly feared and there's nothing they can do about it. They fear to engage with my entire case on how the element of fear, something that stops them from gaining progress to begin with. The mentality of African Americans in the world of status quo is when they are unwilling to go out there and fight for their rights, when they are more likely to stay at home because they constantly fear what will happen outside. We see the point that is only exclusive in a world where African Americans do as such, the government also supports me in this. That's the word that's exclusive to the world of government. Another thing, right? They feel with those contexts. Second, who achieves better change? First of all, we told a change like hardly is going to happen on their side, right? The point which African Americans are even afraid to come out to this government, if that happens, means that more liberal individuals, more interested in other countries and other states will also be actively involved in this. If conflict is something that perpetrates in the world of government, we think that's even better as well. Because the point in which the conflict attracts the interest and attracts the viewpoints of multiple other individuals that can actively fight for the rights of African Americans, we think it's important that they know that they've neglected these individuals to begin with. That they know they've neglected them from the very beginning when they failed to fight for their rights. I think the point which you understand is that side government provides the actual change that you need. Side government is the one that creates an exclusive form, an exclusive need for change to happen for African Americans all around the world.
Guys, thanks for the debate. Cross floor, shake hands while we deliberate. While we vote, sorry.